On this trade deadline day edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we will be discussing Memphis knocking off Toronto in Toronto behind the strong second half performance of Jaren Jackson Jr. and company. We will discuss potential trade targets to keep an eye out on today on this trade deadline day. And I will make a final prediction. Will the Grizzlies make a major move or not? All that and more on this special trade deadline episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this trade deadline day episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for being with me. It is I, Joe Mullinax, your host for this episode of the show. Only I on this trade deadline day. To Michael Cole, very busy guy this time of year. I'm sure you understand as the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. I am happy to take you with me on this journey for the next 30 minutes or so over what will be a very interesting and telling trade deadline for the Memphis Grizzlies. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, literally anywhere. It is all good. Make DeMichael and myself part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every time that an episode drops. And a friendly reminder, a shameless shout out to the daily newsletter. Thank you to everybody that has already subscribed to our free daily newsletter. If you have not done so as of yet, go to LockedOnDaily.com, subscribe to the Locked On Grizzlies free daily newsletter. It's not just words from me. You get NBA analysis, you get fantasy basketball advice, but you get words from me on the Memphis Grizzlies each and every time that a newsletter drops, which is just about every day. Make sure you're checking it out, LockedOnDaily.com, and subscribe to the Locked On Grizzlies free daily newsletter. The Memphis Grizzlies looking the part of a team that's ready for a couple of days off, maybe ready to put the stress of the trade deadline behind them. An all-star break on the horizon for Memphis, of course. An interesting game in Toronto against the Raptors, a trap game. DeMichael and I kind of laid that groundwork for you if you caught our episode yesterday. Worries about looking at this Toronto Raptors team as if they were the team that earned their current 16-35 record. They are not that bad, right? They have been a hot streak of late, one of the better teams in the NBA. They have competed better. That was not to be in this particular contest. It was not meant to be for Toronto. It didn't look that way in the first half. The Raptors went into the halftime break up by 6 on the Memphis Grizzlies, and it looked like maybe it would be an off night for Memphis. Was not the case. The Grizzlies score 85 points in the second half. You heard me correctly. 85 points in the second half. Toronto only scores 48. So Memphis almost laps Toronto in terms of scoring and runs past them pretty impressively and pretty explosively to the final score of 138-107. Where to start? Jaren Jackson Jr. continued his all-NBA campaign. 32 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists. Looked the part of that top 10 or so player in the NBA right now. Certainly deserving of an all-star, and he will be heading to the Bay Area for the all-star festivities next week. Zach Edey in just 25 minutes of play. 13 points back home in Canada. 15 rebounds. Another double-double for Big Edey. Really impressive to see him playing at that level. Off night again for Jalen Wells. Maybe not an off night. That's not entirely fair, but only 7 points and 4 rebounds in 21 minutes of play. Luke Kennard definitely had an off night, 1 for 5 from beyond the arc in what may have been his final game as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies. We'll talk more about that. Brandon Clark looked good in his return back to Canada. G.G. Jackson with 17 points on 8 shots. You heard me right. 17 points on 8 shots. Extremely efficient scoring. 6 rebounds. I'm always going to point out the assists when it comes to GG. Only 1 assist. All the more reason for him to be that 6th man scorer off the bench, and that's exactly what he was again for the Grizzlies against Toronto. So let's keep that energy. It was the return of Vince Williams Jr., did a lot of the heavy lifting kind of garbage man work that he's talked about before, the important jobs. Scored only 4 points, but he got 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals. Vince Williams Jr. fit back in like a glove. Some hot shooting from Scottie Pippen Jr. Marcus Smart did not make a single bucket. Got some good cardio out there. Got a couple assists, though, to only 1 turnover. It was good to see Smart back out on the court. Memphis put out an 11-man rotation in this game before garbage time, and guys like Jake LaRavia, Jay Huff, and John Conchar and Yuki Kawamura, who were, again, the garbage men at the end of the game. It was the starting 5 of Jackson Jr., Wells, Edey, Morant, and Kennard, alongside Brandon Clark, Santi Aldama, Gigi Jackson, Marcus Smart, Vince Williams Jr., and Scottie Pippen Jr. That is interesting to me, and that is where I'm going to be focusing a lot of my energy if Memphis does not make a trade, and that's a big if, right? We'll see what the Grizzlies do here over the next several hours to go. But if Memphis does not make a trade and they move forward with the team as is, when you've won 10 of your last 11 games, it's hard to say that that's too crazy of a thought. And we have to operate back on or based off of past precedents, kind of redundant, based off of precedents that has been set by Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies general manager. Not necessarily the most active team. There might be something that gets done, but Kleiman was never going to trade for Jimmy Butler, right? That nagging rumor that'll never die. That's Golden State's problem now, right? And how convenient that Jimmy Butler signs an extension with that team 2 days after telling Golden State, actually, I'm not going to sign an extension with you. It's all negotiation. It's all a public toying around. It's all a game when it comes to these things between players and organizations. Understandably so. It is a business for everyone involved, after all. But Jimmy Butler wasn't coming to Memphis. And I struggled to see the Grizzlies making a big move. Doesn't mean they won't, because we are in a different space now than we've been in the past, and we'll talk more about that later on in the show. But Marcus Smart, Vince Williams Jr., these guys coming out, being active, an 11-man rotation moving forward that doesn't involve Jake LaRavia. Is Jake LaRavia the odd man out? It's possible. And I think it makes sense on a variety of levels. Because they didn't opt into his team option earlier in the year of his rookie deal, and Memphis being limited in terms of what they can offer him. It's something like 1 year, $5 million, basically what the team option on that rookie contract would have been if Memphis had picked it up. And given the way that LaRavia has played this year, maybe you're not the biggest fan of Jake LaRavia's game, but he's probably going to make more than $5 million a year on his next contract elsewhere. So the future of Jake LaRavia in Memphis is very murky, and we'll touch on that more in a bit. But he was part of the end-of-game mop-up crew in this contest. That might be telling. It might not be. We'll have to see where the team and the roster is momentarily, or in the next several days, or next several hours, I should say. But it was a good win for Memphis there in Toronto. Very happy for the guys. With all the tension and all the talk of Jimmy Butler and, you know, the brief flirtations with Kevin Durant, which almost certainly won't happen now, and all these different things and all these different puzzle pieces being floated, for them to kind of stay the course, right? To see a guy like Jaren Jackson Jr. continue his essential all-NBA campaign. To see Ja Morant, who I have been hard on this program, and don't get me wrong, 4 assists to 5 turnovers from your point guard still isn't good enough. 26 points on 14 shots, that's pretty good. Continued hot shooting from 3 for 7 from beyond the arc. Took advantage of his free throw opportunities, 5 for 6 from the charity stripe. A good game for Ja. Not his best game. The assist to turnover still a concern. But to see Ja getting back into the swing of things, playing consecutive games, Jaren being Jaren. We have to remember that Desmond Bane's currently not playing. So Desmond Bane eventually returns. The broadcast team of Pete Pranica, Brevin Knight, making it sound like maybe as soon as Saturday. Possible they hold Bane out through the All-Star break. But maybe we see Bane back sooner rather than later. And then if that is indeed the case, who does Bane replace in the rotation? Who comes out as Bane comes in? Scottie Pippen Jr.? Maybe. Do they stick with an 11-man rotation? Perhaps. Or do the Grizzlies explore a trade to consolidate the roster? Something that's been talked about here, there, and everywhere on numerous occasions. And one more time before the trade deadline, we're going to discuss it here on Locked On Grizzlies. So shout out to Memphis for the win. Winners of 10 of their last 11 games. One of the hottest teams in the National Basketball Association. Will they attempt to strengthen that roster today? That's going to be our focus next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stick around. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by PrizePicks. Basketball season is heating up, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in awarded winnings, PrizePicks makes it easy and fun to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Here's how it works. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game, where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. I am really interested in looking at more assists for Ja Morant and more points for Jaren Jackson Jr. going into Saturday's game. The best part, PrizePicks keeps it simple. You can set your lineup in less than 60 seconds, and their fast, secure withdrawals mean you get paid quickly when you win. Plus, their Taco Tuesday promo gives you discounted player projections for even more value. Check out the promo tab for all sorts of winning big game lineups as well. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. Run your game. The Memphis Grizzlies are looking at a scenario going into the trade deadline today where they have opportunity in front of them. Because they have control of all of their draft picks, first round draft picks, because they have so many tradable contracts, Marcus Smart's being the biggest, because hopefully we can all agree that Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., Desmond Bane, they're not going anywhere, right? Marcus Smart, maybe. He could go somewhere, about $20 million. That's the biggest tradable contract. An expiring deal with Luke Kennard, John Konchar's $6 million or so that he's making this year. We've seen rumors, speculation, perhaps getting to the 5-yard line and not quite getting into the end zone, as DeMichael has talked about before with that package of Kennard and Konchar for Dorian Finney-Smith. So we know that there is opportunity, if Memphis wants there to be, to upgrade and consolidate this roster. What are some names, or who are some players to keep an eye on as that possibility moves forward? For me, the big name remains Cameron Johnson of the Brooklyn Nets. You've heard him constantly, here, there, and everywhere when it comes to Memphis Grizzlies coverage. And there's a good reason for that, because he's a perfect fit with what Memphis needs. He is an elite floor spacer. When I say elite floor spacer, I mean he is shooting 42% from beyond the arc this season. And if you think that's a fluke, he has shot 37% or better since the 2021-2022 season when he was back on the Phoenix Suns. This is a guy who can flat out shoot the lights out on the basketball. And he finishes well at the rim. And he is shooting an obscene 48% on all of his mid-range jumpers. That's good for 81st percentile in the NBA among forwards, according to Cleaning the Glass. This is somebody who can score the ball. This is somebody who, when given the opportunity, defends at a high rate. He does a really good job defending without fouling. He's actually having the best season of his career in that regard. 2.4% foul rate is among the 75th percentile among forwards in the NBA per Cleaning the Glass. And he checks a lot of boxes in terms of being able to stay in front of guys. Now, is he someone who's going to rack up the stocks? Probably not. He's not going to disrupt passing lanes. Is this a guy that you can look at and say, you go defend the opposing team's best player? Probably not. And maybe that gives people pause. Because if you replace Jalen Wells, who has had a couple of lower production games scoring-wise, with an offensive firecracker, the likes of which that Memphis hasn't seen in a role player specifically, in a Cameron Johnson, you are theoretically robbing Peter to pay Paul, because that means Desmond Bane now has to pick up some of those tougher defensive assignments. But Jalen Wells can obviously still get his minutes. He can still get 20 to 25 minutes a game coming off the bench. And this is a guy in Jalen Wells who, while he's had a Rookie of the Year quality campaign, when you look at him and Zach Edey, Can you think of teams off the top of your head, or even if I gave you some time to research them, that have been legitimate championship contenders while starting 2 rookies? You probably can't. And if you can count those teams literally on one hand. The Memphis Grizzlies starting 1 rookie? Maybe. And maybe you prefer that rookie to be Jalen Wells starting and Zach Edey going to the bench. I think that's a fair argument to make. But I would rather, since Jaren Jackson Jr. has been the Grizzlies' best player this season, I would rather keep Jaren in a comfortable position to get his rhythm early in the contest. That means keeping Jaren at the 4, which means keeping Edey at the 5, and Jalen Wells slides to the bench. Again, he still plays a ton of minutes, still a part of the rotation for a playoff team that's trying to compete for a championship. That ceiling of championship contention is higher if the Memphis Grizzlies go and get Cameron Johnson. I don't see them going for a Kevin Durant. I don't think Durant is going to be leaving Phoenix at this point. That is extremely unlikely in my view. Obviously, the Jimmy Butler stuff is behind Memphis. Lonzo Ball signs a contract extension with the Chicago Bulls, so he will not be traded at the deadline. With those options now out the window, I think that if Cameron Johnson doesn't work out, if Cameron Johnson doesn't fit for whatever reason, I don't know that Memphis makes a consolidation trade in this current environment. I don't know that they go out and try to get a Portland Trailblazers wing, because Portland's been playing some of the best basketball of their season. Why would they disrupt that now? I don't know that Paul George is realistic for them from the Philadelphia 76ers if Philly is really trying to tank. Kyle Kuzma has already been moved to the Bucks. Do you see a rerouting of Chris Middleton to Memphis? Does that really solve the problem for the Grizzlies? Middleton doesn't necessarily fit their timeline the way that Cam Johnson would. So if Cam Johnson doesn't work out, I think a plan B could be something along the lines of future planning. Marcus Smart, theoretically, could be a good player for these Grizzlies if he's able to stay on the floor. We just haven't seen it. And Marcus Smart is due to remain a Memphis Grizzly through the 2026 season. While his contract would not impede future business in terms of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s extension, you can just make things a little bit easier this summer if you replace the deal of Smart with an expiring one like that of Bruce Brown. And we just saw Bruce Brown playing for the Toronto Raptors against the Memphis Grizzlies on Wednesday night. Now, Bruce didn't have his best game, only played 18 minutes, 3 of 9 from the field, was a minus 13 in those 18 minutes. Not his best performance. But again, we just listed earlier in the show all sorts of depth that the Memphis Grizzlies have. If Bruce Brown doesn't play a second for the Memphis Grizzlies, if Memphis decides to buy out Bruce Brown, I wouldn't necessarily do that because it's nice to have a veteran player that has competed for championships on your roster. But if the Grizzlies decided to go that route, it'd be okay. They could sign Cam Spencer or somebody of that ilk, maybe a buyout guy, to try to build their rotation depth, especially a big man if you're not comfortable with where the front court is for Memphis right now. And you could go move forward with that Smart contract off the books and a little more flexibility this summer. That is a real possibility as a plan B. But I do think that plan A, the name that you should keep your ears and eyes open for, is Cam Johnson, because that is the guy who, even if it involves moving on from Santi Aldama, I'm certainly not putting Gigi Jackson or even Vince Williams Jr. in a trade like that. With Santi approaching free agency, restricted free agency, it's possible Santi gets a little too rich for Memphis's blood. And the Nets have been reported as saying that they want a young player as part of any trade. If the Memphis Grizzlies offered Santi Aldama and Marcus Smart for Cam Johnson and a first-round pick, I find it hard to believe that the Brooklyn Nets say no. The Nets can re-sign Santi for less than what Cam Johnson makes, probably around $15 or so million a year. Cam Johnson fits the needs of Memphis in a better way than Santi. He scores the ball 14 points more per 100 shot attempts than Santi does. He defends on the perimeter better than Santi, or at least has the frame that fits that need better. He is a better facilitator. He can do a variety of different things. He is a perfect fourth cog, a fourth man over the next couple of years. He fits this title timeline. There might be some plan Bs, a Bruce Johnson here, another similar type of player there, but Cam Johnson should be the guy that you're keeping an eye out the most heading into the trade deadline this afternoon. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we will close out this episode of the show. I will give you my prediction. Will the Grizzlies actually make a move? Stick around. We're going to talk about it next. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, unfortunately one of them not being my Washington Commanders, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field. The app is super easy to navigate, and you can place a $5 bet, potentially winning $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl. That is icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, an official partner of Super Bowl 59. So here we are, the final countdown, the last show before the trade deadline. I do want to say, obviously, DeMichael has a day job covering the Grizzlies for the Commercial Appeal. He'll have some articles and things to do if a trade goes down, especially one the size of a Cam Johnson deal. But even if something smaller, like we'll talk about here in a minute, DeMichael will be busy. So it'll likely be me, but I too have a day job, and it will probably be delayed in nature, any reaction show, but you will get a reaction show from us in addition to our Friday episode where DeMichael and I will be back recapping everything that was probably the craziest NBA trade deadline in the history of the association. That's coming up. What about now? What do the Memphis Grizzlies do now? What do I foresee happening? There's two paths for me. Earlier in the show, I talked about Marcus Smart and getting off of that money and getting Bruce Brown or somebody of that ilk. I don't think that happens. I don't think the Grizzlies do that. Why? Because I think Marcus Smart has more value to Memphis being that guy than Bruce Brown would. And I don't think that because of the fact that Smart's deal is expiring when Jaren's extension kicks in, it's not like there should be some massive rush to move on from Smart if the deal doesn't make sense. Could it help flexibility this summer? Absolutely. But Marcus Smart has shown enough flashes of good basketball for me, and probably Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies GM, that moving on from him just to do some cap saving in a season where you're trying to compete for a championship, potentially disrupting the energy and the flow of that locker room, the juice isn't worth the squeeze when it comes to somebody like Bruce Brown. Cam Johnson of the Brooklyn Nets, I would do that. The trade that I mentioned earlier, Marcus Smart, Santi Aldama, and a first-round pick, I would do that deal with the Brooklyn Nets, and I think Brooklyn would say yes because it provides for them a veteran leader in Marcus Smart to help guide the early stages of their rebuild. It provides a young player in Santi Aldama that they can get on a good, cost-controlled contract and restricted free agency. And it also gives them additional draft capital. So I could definitely see Brooklyn being interested, at the very least in that framework, and I can see Memphis trying to make that deal. If for whatever reason that trade does not happen, if for whatever reason Brooklyn says no, or Zach Kleiman gets weird with draft pick protections again, like he tried to do with the Conchar and Kennard for Dorian Finney-Smith deal a couple of months ago. If that is the case, I could see Memphis moving on from Jake LaRavia. Because Jake LaRavia, as we saw on Wednesday night, and it was a very small sample size of just one game, but Jake LaRavia was the odd man out. Even with the good season that Jake has had, Jake was the guy that did not get minutes against the Toronto Raptors. He was doing mop-up duty when the game was well in hand. So I could see LaRavia being moved in the wake of all of these bigger trades and roster spots opening up, being sent to a team in a trade exception for a second-round pick. And that might sound like a poor return for Jake LaRavia, but it allows for Memphis to sign someone like a Cam Spencer to a full-blown, full roster deal, the likely Luke Kennard replacement long-term Cam Spencer. And I think that it allows for them to clean up their two-way contracts, bring in somebody new in that regard. And it also makes it so that Jake gets rewarded for the season that he's had. He can go and he can continue to show what he is capable of. If he's not going to be in the rotation in Memphis and he's just riding the bench for the next 30 games and then into the playoffs, his tape is going to be dated. His film, the game that he puts out on the court, which has shown growth, enough growth that I'm pretty confident Memphis regrets not picking up that rookie year team option. That growth continuing on will enable him to get more money and a new contract. That can only come outside of Memphis. So the Grizzlies, in a way, would be continuing their trend, their streak of looking out for players of theirs in deals. Here's a chance for you, Jake, to keep proving to the rest of the league that you belong and that you deserve a second contract that is similar to that of John Konchar, if not better than John Konchar's contract. I would argue LaRavia deserves more. Memphis cannot provide that to him. And the Grizzlies can get additional draft capital that they can either make a pick. We know they're pretty good with those second rounders, right? Or they can use it in a future trade this summer, down the road, whatever the case might be. That is what I foresee. What do I think will happen? Again, if I'm basing it off of precedent, I think the Jake LaRavia trade will happen. It makes too much sense for everybody involved. It's a smaller deal that helps Jake, helps the Grizzlies. Everybody's happy in the end. I think that will happen. What do I hope will happen? I hope that Cam Johnson is a member of the Memphis Grizzlies the next time I talk to you, because that will be evidence even bigger than the Marcus Smart trade. Because when the Marcus Smart trade happened, I told you, dear listener, dear viewer, that I viewed that as the Memphis Grizzlies organization growing up. It was their first act as a contender in terms of trade transaction. They gave up 2 first-round picks as part of that draft, or as part of that trade. They moved on from Tyus Jones, who had shown value. They thought Marcus Smart would be the guy, and maybe he still can be. There's still time. That would help as a veteran defensive presence. Cameron Johnson would come with moving on from Asante Aldama, a drafted, developed part of the Grizzlies ecosystem. You move on from that guy who has proven to be a top 5 or so, 6th man in the NBA this season, that you played a direct role in helping in that happen, plus another draft pick, plus the Marcus Smart guy that you gave up 2 firsts for before, to bring in Cameron Johnson, to be that 4th man, to be that floor spacer, that offensive weapon that takes this scheme that is already setting records everywhere in terms of the Memphis Grizzlies record books, to take it to the next level. Sign me up for that. I do that trade. And I think that it makes the roster make more sense. If you go with 11-man rotation, you're not really kicking anybody else to the curb. John Konchar's still there. Jay Huff's still there. Those guys probably shouldn't be playing minutes for a serious playoff title contender. You want to go 11-man rotation? You can still do that, and then things condense in the postseason. Minutes increase. You've got a 10-man rotation that can really do some things. That is what I hope to see. My official prediction, the trade doesn't happen. Zach Kleiman, with his ways of operating with first-round picks, I don't think Brooklyn's going to pull that trigger. They might send Cameron Johnson somewhere else because he's going to hurt their tanking opportunity. Brooklyn's playing too well at times. They got to get rid of their good players to make sure they get that top draft pick. But will they find a better deal than what Zach Kleiman will offer them? Or will Kleiman learn his lesson? History tells me that Kleiman's going to operate and run his race regardless of what those around him do. Should he overpay for Cameron Johnson? I think so. Will it happen? I'm not so sure. Jake LaRavia being sent out for draft capital? I could see that happening. Thank you so much for being with me on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. The next time we're together, barring some major trade deadline dealings, will be our Friday edition. Michael Cole and I will be back together breaking down all the trade deadline news, what comes next for Memphis, and we'll be previewing the big showdown game on Saturday night between the Memphis Grizzlies and the Oklahoma City Thunder. Make sure you're with us for that Friday show. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Wherever you get podcasts, we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. YouTube, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, literally anywhere you get podcasts, make sure you're checking us out. Also, make sure you're subscribing to our free daily newsletter, lockedondaily.com. Great NBA analysis, great fantasy basketball advice, and words from me on the Memphis Grizzlies each and every day. Make sure you're subscribed and check out our free daily newsletter over at lockedondaily.com. Thank you for being with me on this special trade deadline edition, preview edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Again, maybe Cam Johnson is a Memphis Grizzly, and you'll see me sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we'll talk on Friday. Stay locked in. Enjoy the trade deadline and all the fun that it provides. We'll catch you next time here on Locked On Grizzlies. See ya.